Hello, and thank you very much for coming along this evening. This evening is just the week past the end of Black History Month, and we're going to spend some time today looking at, in fact, what new kinds of innovations are being undertaken in the study of African history, pioneered in many cases right here in Cambridge. So there are several reasons to look into it. But in particular, we want to look at what's being called a kind of new approach to studying old maps as a resource for looking into what might be called the archaeology of the slave trade. So we're calling it Old Maps, Picks and Shovels, Steps Toward an Archaeology of the Slave Trade. And it's followed by a quote from a very famous poem that focuses our attention on, was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? The question was put by a very famous 20th century author, but we'll look at it a little bit further as a result of what we're going to undertake here. In Black History Month in the past, it's those of you who watch this program know, we've given several tributes to Henry Louis Gates, Jr., professor over at Harvard, and for a long time a resident of Cambridge, in fact, a living legend in Cambridge. In fact, we, in the recent period, looked into recalling some aspects of America's immigration policies in Black History Month, in part to remind ourselves of the silliness of current discourse about making America great again. It's no doubt that we should look into the greatness of America, but we're not going to be able to understand what made America great if we don't look into its entire history and its immigration history. It's really quite staggering to talk about what made America great without understanding the history of the slave trade. Probably the largest pre-modern history in energy transfer in human history. Certainly the largest non-voluntary migration in human history, and it had all to do with the energy being brought into America from Black Africa. Well, it's encouraged a lot of scholars to start looking at the Jefferson Library and at other libraries from the 18th century because they have extraordinary amounts of material. And one important new field of African history is being launched with a close digital examination of the historical texts and their printed maps. And it's important to emphasize, and their printed maps, because often the maps haven't been studied as carefully as the texts. In part, this is because historians are drawn toward text and don't know what to do with maps. And the maps themselves are problematic because in many cases they're drawn by people who've never been to the area. It seems odd, but it's true. A lot of the travelogue maps are drawn by people who are in effect sitting in Europe and depending upon accounts that were written by others, and they then drew maps on the basis of the written accounts. Now, one project of historical cartography focuses upon these different kinds of layers of understanding. You can't just take a map from these periods and understand it as a true representation, even with the approximate instrumentation available to scholars and mariners at the time. They did their best, but in many cases the maps are more pictorial than historiographic. So a lot of historical research has to be done on any particular map to find out whether it's representing eyewitness accounts or something filtered through years and years of transmission through other sources. In any case, there is an international online digital map archive that's emerging for reference, teaching, and research in African and African American history. And that's one of the projects that's underway. There are similar projects underway elsewhere on the other side of the Atlantic, in the Caribbean. There is an early Caribbean digital archive that's been organized, and people are starting to share works through digital collections online. It's very valuable material. Here at Harvard, Dr. Vincent Brown, who's the Charles Warren Professor of History and Professor of African and African American History Studies, has pulled together a brand new operation based on his own awareness for years of the value of things like maps. He's looked at the slave revolt in Jamaica from 1760 to 61 in great detail in the historical material of the map. He's actually traced down the map that chronicled the revolt during this 2-year period, and in fact does a kind of day-by-day analysis of the key outbreaks of the revolt around the island, making it clear that it was a very sophisticated revolt, not simply an idea that spread from one place to another, but that erupted simultaneously with communications between revolting groups around the island, but no common command structure. It really is quite an extraordinary history, and he's made very good use of historical maps in looking at that. He's also gone on to set up at Harvard a thing called the History Design Studio. And you can learn about it by looking online, designing new modes of historical storytelling is its intention. And if you look at it in detail, you can get the description from the website. The History Design Studio is a year-long workshop for developing, critiquing, and producing new projects in multimedia history. Workshops include group discussion, collaborative brainstorming, rapid prototyping of exercises, and formal and informal group critique sessions with guest critics. Now, this is an extraordinary effort on the part of graduate students and other scholars in the area, and they can start with volumes like this: encyclopedias, compilations, travelogue accounts, and if you look at things like this, L'Histoire des Voyages, a multi-volume set of travelogues and transcribed travel descriptions of parts of West Africa that appeared in French, L'Histoire des Voyages. It's a very important collection of this kind of material, because you can see the volume is here, but the fold-out maps are extraordinary. They're big, they're very detailed, and they can now be digitized. Digitization makes it possible for numerous scholars to work collaboratively in detail on various aspects of a map. People who are not French-speaking may not be able to read all the annotations, but those can easily be translated. Those who are more familiar with the place names on these maps, as in the place names along the Gold Coast, or what became known as the Gold Coast, or at current-day Ghana, can delve into this in great detail and look at sectors of the map, zooming in on various portions that they know personally, and looking at different sites on the maps indicated. They notice as well that there are fathom depths indicated by the mariners at the time. A fathom is about 6 feet or 2 yards, and it in fact shows how deep the anchorage points are, and how as they approach the coast it's easier and easier to anchor an ocean-going vessel. Furthermore, these encyclopedia contain illustrations of the different fortresses that the Europeans established on the coast, along with their floor plans and an indication of the square footage and the amount devoted to each activity within the fort. They can be seen by tourists these days because these are substantial structures that have not been blown away or fallen over. In fact, they can be viewed from space in a very powerful way that historians have begun to do by linking up the digital maps and the digital versions of the historic material that are available in these travelogues, and looking more precisely at where they end up. If you go into Google Earth, you can actually take a look at some of this material from space, and you can fly around it. In an odd sort of way, you can look down on it from the satellites that the United States Navy controls the signal from, and you can look at this as a flyby effort. You can see it from all angles. You can move in on it. You can see the canoes. They're located in the little lagoon that are being used by fishermen in this offshore area. But this is a major structure and can be viewed, as I say, from space at several different levels, and you can in fact zero in on it very closely. So closely, in fact, that you can reconstruct the floor plan that's also produced in those early maps and the early views and take a look at them from inside. In cases like this, you can click on the blue lines and actually take a look at what the fortress looks like through a series of photos that have been made available through a coordination of screens. You can see there's an inner wall and an outer wall, and on the outer wall there are very substantial cannons placed in various places in order to do what? Well, basically keep other European rivals from getting anywhere near the shore. These cannons are aimed out at sea. And we can learn a great deal from this kind of thing, from this parachuting in, thanks to the United States Navy, as it were, to various fortresses on the coast of West Africa. More to the point, though, we can go back and do a detailed study of the architecture of these places, see how they're put together, not only trace their European origins and obvious forms, but actually make some calculations about how many slaves could have been kept here, what were the size of the dungeons, what were the size of the food supplies, where was the water coming from. These are the kinds of questions that archaeologists would ask. It's a substantial structure. It raises the question, how are these things built? These aren't temporary. They have existed for several hundred years and they haven't fallen over. They have craggy blocks of stone. Now it may well be that these cannons carry with them, and they do in fact carry an emblem of George, King of England. George III, King of England. This is his mark, left on every cannon. But if you look at the fortresses all up and down the coast, and we've started to do this with old maps and new narratives, digitizing historical maps to analyze new dimensions of the Atlantic trade, you can take map after map after map and see a great deal of new information that we can then correlate with things on the ground and begin new kinds of inquiries. It's possible to geo-reference these maps and take a very close look at some of these areas. If you go into Google Earth, for example, you'll actually be able to zoom in from space, again, right into a place like the Gambia River and take a look at the current history as well as the current disposition of the Gambia River. This is actually quite an extraordinary effort, because you can take the old map and zoom to the map laid on top of Google Earth and look at greater and greater detail at the old map and begin to see things come into focus that weren't visible in the first instance, like this island of James, it's called. It's in fact known as the Île de Saint James, or Saint Jean, or Saint Jacob in the Dutch texts. But it's a little island in the middle of the Gambian River that has very shallow fathom points, easy to anchor, and a structure on it, which you can see on these old maps. Well, what can in fact you see if you remove the map? You can actually go over and remove the map at the same time as, in effect, calling up the layer from Google Earth underneath it. And that Google Earth layer has a lot of interesting things on it as well. If we take out the map and look at the area underneath it, we can learn a great deal from zooming in again. If you zoom in with this kind of resolution, you can find the island that is still there. Keep zooming in and you'll see that there is in fact an island that has structures on it that we don't fully understand from space, but it would be possible to look at it close up. And we can look into it as a 360 view. Watch this, it's really quite clever. In terms of the capacity now available on computers to take a picture. You can now see some of the old cannons that were preserved there. You can see, in fact, there's a multi-story structure here with an individual down there explaining what's going on between these craggy blocks of stone, which seem to be the ruins of a major structure with lots of trees growing through it and around it at this time. But in effect, you can take your own virtual tour of this structure through the internet, as it turns out. You can exit the photo, go back to the picture, and see it as if it were an island that had been mapped at the time. Well, as in fact is the case, it was mapped, and it can be looked at in detail along with the country around it. If you look at some of these things in detail, it's pretty extraordinary, because from books like this, you can get the floor plans and the profiles of that structure that has some remains left there now. In fact, you can get a pretty detailed diagram of what it looked like from the north side and what it looked like from the south side, even though it's in Dutch in this case, and the fort is referred to as St. James because by this time it had become a fort controlled by the English. The floor plan is in fact very interesting and can be looked at in detail to see what they were doing in each one of these areas, storing slaves, storing food, storing water. How many slaves could be stored here in 1732 on this island in Gambia?
This island, Kunta Kinte Island and related sites.
Well, as it turns out, UNESCO has designated this site as something worth preserving. Let's take a look.
Island is situated at the mouth of the Gambia River in Gambia. The island was ruled by successive European countries. The remains of the fortress on the island show that from the 16th century on, various European countries fought to gain control of the slave trade here. Captured slaves were confined on this island until they were sent to the New World by ship. The opposite shore of the island is a former marketplace. This is Jufure village. It has become a pilgrimage and tourist site for people of African origin.
Well, the reason for that is that this became quite famous because of the work of American writers and historians writing about roots in Africa. It's also possible to look at other islands like this one in Senegal, and this too has been visited by people more recently. Take a look.
Today we boarded a ferry to Gorée Island, which is just off the coast of Senegal. Now, for roughly 300 years, until the mid-1840s, millions of men, women, and children from Africa were kidnapped from their homes and communities and brought to this island to be sold as slaves. Now, on the island, we saw cells where dozens of people were packed together for months on end. We saw the courtyard where they were forced to stand naked while buyers examined them, negotiated a price, and bought them as if they were nothing but property. And we saw what is known as the door of no return, the doorway through which these men and women and children passed on their way across the ocean to a life of slavery, a brutal journey many of us know as the Middle Passage.
Well, it's an extraordinary moment for President Obama and his wife, and she recorded it on whitehouse.gov. The White House has changed hands since then, and you can no longer find it on whitehouse.gov, but you can find other things of equally compelling narrative force. You can look at these castles from space, see them in the inside, and take a look at the size involved here. It's enormous. These are big structures, European castles from the late medieval, early modern period, and they have been built by someone. Just think of it for a moment, as the poet Bertolt Brecht did in writing a poem called A Worker Reads History. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? And Babylon, so many times destroyed, who built the city up each time? In which of Lima's houses, that city glittering with gold, lived those who built it? In the evening, when the Chinese wall was finished, where did the masons go? Imperial Rome is full of arcs of triumph. Who reared them up? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Byzantium lives in song. Were all her dwellings palaces? And even in the Atlantis of legend, the night the seas rushed in, the drowning men still bellowed for their slaves. Young Alexander conquered India. He alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Was there not even a cook in his army? Philip of Spain wept as his fleet was sunk and destroyed. Were there no other tears? Frederick the Great triumphed in the 7 Years' War. Who triumphed with him? Each page a victory. At whose expense the victory ball? Every 10 years a great man. Who paid the piper? So many particulars, so many questions. So, let's think hauled the craggy blocks of stone. Fortunately, there's a new kind of alliance of citizens and scientists who are looking into this in the slave trade, and the alliance is vital.